764 engines of sovereignty lined the Sahel sun, and not a single donor flag fluttered. For decades, roads in Africa were ribboned with the logos of lenders, and dignity was mortgaged to debt. But on a blazing afternoon in Ouagadougou, a different scene unfolded. Not a gift, not a grant, not a plea. Machines bought, delivered, and unveiled by Burkina Faso hands. This is more than steel. It is a rupture in the story long told to Africa, that progress only arrives when outsiders bless it. It is a reminder that aid dependency was never a law of nature, but a habit imposed, rehearsed, and repeated. And now, a nation often dismissed as fragile has placed sovereignty on wheels, ready to cut new roads into forgotten soil. Stay close. This is not a headline. It is a hinge. If this stirs your sense of dignity, subscribe and keep walking with us. Burkina Faso's gesture has unsettled its neighbors, startled global institutions, and reignited a question that lingers beyond borders. If one landlocked nation can fund its own roads, what stops a continent from redrawing its future? The engines were only the beginning. The Sahel has long been associated with fragility, a band of dust and conflict where headlines often dwell on displacement and despair. Yet on a searing afternoon in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, that image cracked. Rows upon rows of bulldozers, graders, compactors, and excavators stood gleaming under the fierce light, lined with military precision. 764 machines. The number alone is staggering for a landlocked nation of modest means. And yet there they were, steel giants awaiting orders, each one financed not by donors or loans, but by the national treasury. In most African capitals, the unveiling of such infrastructure is stage theater. A foreign ambassador cuts the ribbon. An international lender takes the podium. Presidents are photographed beneath banners of gratitude, signaling to their citizens that development is delivered through supplication. Not here. No IMF delegation hovered. No European minister wagged a finger about fiscal discipline. There was silence. Silence so loud it thundered. Because this time, no one else could take the credit. The symbolism ran deeper than the machinery itself. Each machine was a seed sown into the soil of dignity. The bulldozers promised not just roads, but the possibility of connecting markets that had been left to languish. The graders whispered of smoother journeys for farmers transporting produce. The compactors suggested durability, not merely of asphalt, but of sovereignty. And the excavators were shovels of defiance, digging a trench between dependency and determination. For decades, Burkina Faso's roads bore the stamp of outside benefactors. Bridges carried plaques that praised foreign partners. Entire highways were announced as gifts, not as obligations fulfilled by a government to its own citizens. It bred a culture of gratitude, of bowing heads before lenders. But this display of machinery broke that cycle. It was more than procurement. It was a declaration. The decision to acquire such a fleet did not emerge in a vacuum. Burkina Faso had endured repeated shocks, security crises, sanctions, economic isolation. With many predicting collapse, the government made a radical choice: to seize the reins of its own resources and redirect them inward. This meant confronting the paradox that had plagued the country for decades: immense gold reserves underground, yet chronic poverty above. Though the precise procurement mechanisms remain missing, details of suppliers and financing structure, the message was unmistakable. Development would no longer be outsourced. For the ordinary citizens standing in the crowd that day, the machines represented more than metal. They were visible proof that the wealth of the nation could finally manifest in something tangible, something touchable. No longer abstract promises on donor spreadsheets. No longer conditional loans written in foreign capitals, but real machines standing on Burkina Faso soil, ready to be deployed across provinces. The economic potential was immediate. Road construction could shorten travel times, lower transport costs, and open rural markets that had remained inaccessible. For farmers, this could mean perishable crops reaching urban centers before rotting. For traders, it could mean new corridors of commerce, linking dusty towns with bustling cities. For the unemployed, it could mean jobs, not just operating the machines, but maintaining them, supplying parts, fueling an ecosystem of work, missing projected employment figures. The psychological impact, however, may prove even greater than the economic. Across Africa, the unveiling was broadcast as a challenge. If a small sanctioned nation with limited reserves could mobilize such a fleet, what excuse did larger economies have? The machines were not just destined to carve roads, they were carving reputations. They turned Burkina Faso from a footnote into a benchmark. And so the story of that afternoon is more than ceremonial. It is a recalibration of identity. A country that once featured in international reports as aid-dependent now presented itself as aid-defiant. Each machine was a chapter in a new narrative. That sovereignty is not begged for, but built, one engine at a time. Yet even as the applause rang out, a question lingered in the Sahel air. Steel can be bought, lined up, and admired. But sovereignty is not forged in a single afternoon. The greater story lies not in the machines themselves, but in the ledger that made them possible. But steel alone does not explain the ledger. Where did the sovereignty fund itself? The silence in Ouagadougou was deliberate. No speeches, no staged gratitude, no parade of foreign dignitaries. The machines themselves were the speech, and in that silence lay the power. For a continent accustomed to seeing foreign flags flutter at every ribbon cutting, this absence was deafening. The silence thundered louder than any anthem. Across Africa, the reaction was immediate. In Abuja, commentators scrambled to explain why the continent's oil giant could not do the same. In Nairobi, analysts insisted the spectacle was symbolic, a temporary flourish that would soon rust away. In Pretoria, elites murmured excuses about scale, about context, about unique circumstances. Yet beneath every rationalization was unease. For the sight of 764 machines lined up without donor logos pierced through decades of complacency. Ordinary citizens across the continent watched the images and felt a surge of pride and shame. Pride that an African nation had defied the script. Shame that their own governments, far wealthier and freer, had not dared. Social media lit up with comparisons. Nigeria's oil, Kenya's tech sector, South Africa's platinum. How could these giants, with all their resources, remain tethered to lenders while a landlocked country under sanctions declared independence with steel? International media, meanwhile, tried to frame the event through the old lens. Reports spoke of risks to fiscal stability and concerns over sustainability. The IMF warned of investor confidence, European officials fretted about budgetary transparency, and development think tanks questioned the durability of the machines. Yet their tone betrayed anxiety. For once, the donor class was not in control of the narrative. A sovereign act had stolen the spotlight, and their words felt like aftershocks rather than commands. The psychological effect was perhaps the sharpest weapon. The unveiling did not simply provide infrastructure. It shattered the illusion that aid dependency was inevitable. For decades, citizens were told that their nations could not finance progress without loans. That message, repeated in conference halls and press releases, had seeped into collective consciousness. Burkina Faso's machines broke that spell. They stood as visible, immovable proof that another path exists. This is why the event struck deeper than roads. It was not just asphalt in the making. It was imagination in revolt. Suddenly, Africans began asking a dangerous question. If Burkina Faso can, why not us? The question echoed in Bamako, in Lagos, in Johannesburg. Leaders who once hid behind excuses now found themselves exposed. The tension between symbolism and substance quickly emerged. Critics argued that machines alone do not build roads. They require fuel, maintenance, trained operators, and long-term planning, missing estimated annual maintenance costs. Supporters countered that symbolism matters, that symbols ignite courage, and that courage is the first step towards transformation. Both sides knew one thing. The machines had altered the conversation. And in Ouagadougou itself, the atmosphere was electric. Citizens saw more than vehicles. They saw sovereignty materialized. For a farmer, it meant the prospect of reaching markets faster. For a trader, it meant lower costs. For a young mechanic, it meant new opportunities to work and learn. For the nation, it meant a rare moment of unity, a shared sense of defiance against the idea that dignity must be borrowed. The international order felt the sting too. Western capitals, accustomed to framing the Sahel as dependent, now whispered about instability. Translation: their access to resources and influence had been disrupted. In policy circles, phrases like political earthquake began to circulate. For institutions that thrived on dependency, the display of sovereignty was unsettling precisely because it was undeniable. The crescendo of emotion reached its peak in the contrast. Machines without foreign flags, a leader without apologies, a nation without excuses. The silence of the ceremony became the roar of defiance across a continent. And yet, as the dust settled, one question gnawed at the narrative. Pride may pave the way, but sovereignty must be financed. Machines of such scale do not fall from the sky. They are bought, paid for, and accounted for. Where had Burkina Faso found the means? Follow the vein of gold. There lies the secret of how the books were balanced. The rows of machines in Ouagadougou were not only spectacle, they were promise. And when steel turns into roads, promises become consequences. The effects were felt swiftly in civil life, politics, and the fragile fabric of sovereignty. In the short term, the symbolism itself provided oxygen. Citizens who had long grown cynical about leadership suddenly saw visible proof that wealth could be redirected. It was not an abstract announcement buried in policy papers, but tangible engines standing under the sun. Trust, however fragile, began to flicker again. For decades, aid dependency had corroded the bond between state and people. Now, with national resources channeled into national projects, that bond showed signs of repair. Economically, the potential ripple effects were immense. Roads are not mere stretches of asphalt, they are lifelines. In rural Burkina Faso, farmers often saw their harvest rot before reaching markets. A lack of infrastructure turned abundance into waste. With new roads, the journey from village to city could be shortened, costs reduced, and access widened. Missing data on reduced transport time or cost once projects began. Traders spoke of opportunities to expand. Truckers anticipated shorter hauls, and local businesses prepared for new flows of goods. Each kilometer of road was not only concrete, but commerce. Politically, the machines symbolized more than infrastructure. They signaled a reconfiguration of power. For too long, the state's legitimacy was borrowed from donor conferences and foreign investments. Every ribbon cut by a foreign official chipped away at sovereignty. Now, legitimacy was reclaimed in steel and soil. When Burkina leaders cut their own ribbons, they were not just opening roads, they were reopening trust. The effects rippled into security as well. In a land scarred by insurgency, roads are arteries of presence. They allow the state to extend services, deploy forces, and connect citizens in distant provinces. For communities long abandoned, the promise of a road was more than convenience. It was protection. Infrastructure is not just development, it is strategy. Each grader pushing soil was also pushing back against isolation, which had often been the breeding ground for unrest. But the consequences were not only hopeful. Critics warned that machines require maintenance, operators, and fuel. Without sustained planning, the fleet could deteriorate, missing projected budget for maintenance and fuel allocation. Others raised questions about long-term financing. While gold revenues had provided the capital, could they provide the continuity? Development is not an event but a habit, and habits require discipline. Yet perhaps the sharpest consequence was psychological. Across Africa, the event in Ouagadougou had already shifted the burden of proof. Leaders could no longer excuse dependency as destiny. Citizens began to question, if Burkina Faso could, why not us? The revelation stung particularly in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, where abundant resources had long been offset by external borrowing. The narrative had changed. Dependency was not inevitable, it was a choice. And within Burkina Faso itself, politics took a new tone. The government's wager was bold. By funding development visibly, it could undercut the roots of corruption. No longer could elites siphon donor funds unseen because projects now emerged from domestic coffers. Every bulldozer and grader was an anti-corruption billboard, a demonstration that national wealth could yield national benefit. For many, this was the quiet revolution hidden within the steel. It is here that the phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup resurfaced in debates. For some, it referred to the military takeover that brought him to power. For others, it described the broader upheaval. The coup against dependency, the coup against corruption, the coup against despair. Whatever its interpretation, it became shorthand for the audacity to redirect wealth towards citizens. And in that sense, the coup was not merely political, it was existential. Yet sovereignty cannot stop at machines. Asphalt cannot feed a nation. Roads may carry goods, but they cannot fill stomachs. And so the bold experiment in Burkina Faso pointed inevitably to the next battlefield. Because if dignity is to be more than tarmac, it must be rooted in the soil itself. But a nation cannot eat asphalt. The next field of battle is the soil itself. When the images of 764 machines lined across Ouagadougou reached international screens, the ripples spread quickly beyond the Sahel. What looked like a domestic act of procurement reverberated as a geopolitical tremor. Within Africa, organizations like the African Union and ECOWAS watched uneasily. Their public statements, missing dates and wording of official declarations, emphasized stability and regional cooperation. Yet behind the scenes, officials grappled with a precedent they had not set. If one nation could bypass the donor model, How long before others followed? The fear was not about machines, it was about contagion. In Brussels and Paris, the event was framed in terms of fiscal sustainability and investor confidence. European partners, long accustomed to shaping Sahelian budgets, found themselves sidelined. Aid had always functioned not just as support, but as leverage. The unveiling of sovereignty-funded machines threatened to weaken that leverage. For policymakers, the sight of Burkina Faso flags standing alone was more than symbolic. It was unsettling. Washington, too, paid attention. The United States had long balanced its Sahel strategy on three pillars: counterterrorism, democracy promotion, and economic aid. Yet the Ouagadougou spectacle complicated that calculus. If a nation under sanctions could mobilize resources independently, the narrative of dependency that underpinned much of Western engagement began to fray. Missing U.S. State Department statement or media comment. Analysts warned that the symbolism could embolden movements across the region seeking sovereignty on their own terms. Development institutions reacted predictably. The World Bank and IMF highlighted risks of debt sustainability, despite the irony that the machines were purchased without loans. Their unease was less about the numbers than about the precedent. For decades, they had positioned themselves as gatekeepers of African development. Now, Burkina Faso had staged a demonstration that bypassed their gate entirely. Beyond institutions, ordinary observers in the global south read the event differently. In Latin America and Asia, commentators noted echoes of their own struggles against dependency. The story traveled as a case study of defiance. Small, sanctioned, resource-rich, yet determined to reclaim control. The narrative of Africa can only develop with help had cracked. For scholars and activists, the phrase Burkina Faso revolution began circulating as shorthand for this moment. It did not simply mean a political shift within the borders of one state. It meant a recalibration of global imagination. If sovereignty could be displayed through machinery, then the very symbols of aid dependency were vulnerable. And so, international reactions revealed the fault lines. Institutions spoke of risks, elites spoke of instability, but citizens across continents spoke of possibility. In the clash of interpretations, one truth lingered. The image of steel in the Sahel could not be erased. Yet sovereignty is not sustained by headlines. Machines may shake the order, but hunger still humbles nations. And the fiercest challenge lies not in gold or asphalt, but in the grain that sustains life. And still, sovereignty starves if the stomach kneels. What happens when the granary answers to no donor? The unveiling of machines and the reclamation of gold were not an ending. They were a beginning. Burkina Faso now stands on a crossroads where sovereignty must be translated into structure and where the promises of today must become the policies of tomorrow. The first road ahead is practical. 764 machines are powerful symbols, but they also require upkeep. Fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and skilled operators must be secured. Missing projected annual operating budget. If these giants of steel are to carve lasting roads, the state must invest not only in purchase, but in permanence. Without discipline, what begins as sovereignty could rust into waste. The second road is agricultural. Machines can connect villages, but it is the soil that must feed them. Ibrahim Traoré has already signaled the shift, from reclaiming gold to reclaiming grain. Investment in irrigation, seed distribution, and processing plants marks an attempt to end the most dangerous dependency of all: hunger. If roads are the arteries of sovereignty, food is its heartbeat. Without it, no nation stands tall. The third road is institutional. Sovereignty cannot survive if corruption seeps back in. By financing projects through national revenues, the government has cut off one pipeline of graft, donor funds, but vigilance remains essential. Visibility of results must continue. Citizens must see schools rising, hospitals operating, and harvests reaching markets. If sovereignty is not made visible, it risks dissolving into rhetoric. Risks remain formidable. Sanctions may tighten, global markets may fluctuate, and external pressure may attempt to isolate Ouagadougou. Machines may be sabotaged, revenues strained, and food production tested by drought. Yet opportunity grows alongside risk. Regional alliances across the Sahel could turn sovereign experiments into collective strength. Domestic industries could emerge around construction, maintenance, and food processing. Youth trained today could become custodians of tomorrow's sovereignty. For Africa at large, Burkina Faso's path is a provocation. It raises a question to neighbors richer in resources but poorer in resolve. Will they continue to trade sovereignty for loans, or will they take the harder road? The harder road is never the easiest. It demands patience, sacrifice, and resilience. But it also yields the harvest of dignity. The vision ahead is not one of sudden miracles, but of steady seasons. Roads that connect markets, fields that feed families, institutions that answer to citizens, not creditors. A sovereignty lived, not claimed. If this is only the first harvest, what will the second season bring? Sovereignty is not forged in speeches alone. It is built in steel, seeded in soil, and safeguarded in the choices of leaders. Burkina Faso has shown that even a small landlocked nation can redirect its destiny by reclaiming what was once surrendered. The machines in Ouagadougou are not simply tools. They are declarations that roads will be paved by national hands. The reclaimed gold is not merely wealth, it is justice returned to the people. The fields now sown with new energy are not just agriculture. They are freedom sprouting from the ground itself. This moment has lifted the imagination of a continent. For too long, Africans were told that loans were lifelines and aid was salvation. Yet here stands proof that dependency was never destiny. It was a choice. And when choice is reclaimed, dignity follows. The world has already labeled it many things: a gamble, a spectacle, a risk. But for those who walk Burkina Faso's roads, ride its buses, or eat from its renewed harvest, it is something simpler. It is home built by their own hands. The Burkina Faso revolution is not about one fleet of machines or one season of grain. It is about the slow, patient rewriting of a social contract in which the state no longer begs but builds, and the people no longer wait but walk forward. Much will depend on whether governance keeps pace with ambition. The phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup has already become shorthand for rupture, but its truest meaning will not be measured in headlines. It will be measured in schools that open, hospitals that heal, and roads that endure. Long after hashtags fade, citizens will ask whether the promise was kept. For if the Ibrahim Traoré coup is to be remembered as more than a moment, it must become a movement. And so, the question remains, if one small nation can chart this path, what stops the rest of the continent from doing the same? If this story resonates with your sense of sovereignty, do not drift away. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and stand with the work that lies ahead.